Greetings. This is Andrew from A Tree with Roots Music, coming to you from Salt Lake City, Utah. I was extremely excited to receive your letters and to hear that you got to watch our documentary as part of your seventh grade English class. How cool is that? Good teachers. I got some awesome letters and I wanted to read and answer some of the questions. This one is from Ella. To Andrew and David, I thought your video was very cool. I found it really interesting how different each instrument was, completely different in sound, shape, and size. The way that they sounded were very unique to what we hear in the US. I agree. My favorite instrument was the one that looked like a hollowed out violin. It sounded very pretty. Yes, indeed. That is the sarangi. The sarangi is an instrument typically found in India, a slightly different version, and Nepal, which is a version that you saw in our documentary. It is a four-string instrument that is played by putting your fingers so that your fingernail lightly touches the string, and you have a lot of vibration with a bow. And it also allows for the use of the entire spectrum of notes, so that there's a lot of sliding and what they call glissando and drone sound. It's really, really beautiful. I agree. And that kind of brings us to your question here. Are the notes and composition the artists read the same from in the US? That's a really good question. I think sometimes we just assume that the notes that we read in Western music, or that I read and was brought up on in Western music, is the same as everybody else in the world. But music is as old as human beings. And so obviously, depending on where you come and what language you speak and what culture you come from, you're going to have different ways of writing and explaining things. So music notation is a way for us to define something that we've heard with our ear into something that we can reproduce and teach others. It's an alternative to just teaching by ear. So I thought that was a really great question. I wanted to show a few examples. This first one is Woody Guthrie song, This Land Is Your Land. And this would be your typical Western notation, so something that came from Europe and was a way to describe every version of how a note could be played and held. Then the second one is going to be from India, and this is a chant, an Indian chant, and you can see it has different sounds but also different notes associated. This next one is from Russia, also a chant, and you can see different lengths of breath and bend of note are trying to be described here. And this last one is from Korea, which looks quite different from music notation that is used in Western cultures. I think the sarangi is a great example of showing how there are more notes than within an octave than what are typically heard in Western music. So, for instance, this is an octave, and in Western music, it is typically divided into 12 notes. And then we've divided that further into a scale, so something that sounds a little easier to hear. That's the 8-note scale. But our 12 notes aren't necessarily the same in all over the world either. So in India, for instance, they use an 11-note scale. In Thailand, they use a 7-note scale. And it's different ways to divide that same distance up to get different feelings and emotions. So that's a really great question asking about the sarangi and the notation there. How long did it take to make this video? Well, David and myself traveled to Nepal for about 2 weeks, I think it was. And it can be tough to make films and go through traveling like that because it can be difficult to get accustomed to the new food and time and everything of where you are. So it always feels very quick to pass. But I think we did it in about 2 weeks, and then that's just the filming. And then we went to back to Davidstown in Rhode Island, and we probably spent another 2 or 3 weeks editing, getting it how we want before you see it. How long do these instruments go back? These instruments, it varies a little bit. The first instruments that are thought to have existed are drums, flutes, and stringed instruments like a lute, which comes from Western Europe and Arabia. I think the sarangi that you saw in the video might have some origin in that part of the world. The first, I did look that up, and the first notation found for sarangi is in 17th century Nepalese classical music. So in the 1600s, for sure this instrument was being played, but probably for several thousand years prior to that. Other than that, you saw a lot of drums, and drums are some of the first instruments that humans have made. Just a piece of wood with what was typically an animal skin tightened over the top to resonate. And I know you saw some of that in our video with the Panchabaja band, which is a big family band with lots of drums, and then a reed instrument similar to an oboe that the gentleman was playing. Also, I think singing and dancing is not, oh, you wouldn't always consider an instrument, but you saw in this documentary that that's a huge part of traditional music, and that's an instrument that everyone carries with them from birth. Why did you choose to focus on this topic in Nepal specifically? Well, we love to travel, and David and I made a documentary in the Solomon Islands, which is a country very remotely placed in the South Pacific Ocean. We made a documentary there, and then we premiered it at a film festival in Kathmandu in Nepal. And because we had traveled to Nepal to show our film at this film festival, we decided to stay extra in the country afterwards and meet as many musicians as we could and film another documentary because we just love to do it. And a place like the Solomon Islands and Nepal, they're very different, but they also share challenges going forward, which is a fast developing country, a lot of Western culture being celebrated, specifically by the youth, and just a fast changing landscape because of development. So we also find it important when we travel to somewhere like that to celebrate the traditional musical forms as much as we can, and to meet those people who are masters of the form while they're still living, and make sure to try to do our part to make sure that this music persists going forward and isn't lost. So thank you for your letter, and hopefully we get to hear more.